Good afternoon. Welcome to the 4 p.m. edition of Arirang News on Wednesday, June 3rd. I'm Yusujin. Today is local election day in South Korea with several closely watched races set to shape the nation's political landscape. Let's begin with our first story. Now, there are just 2 hours to go now before the local election polling stations closed, after which ballot counting will begin immediately. We now turn to our correspondent Jung Hae-rim, who is standing by at a polling station in Seoul. So, Hae-rim, what are you seeing there right now?
Hi, Sujin. I'm currently outside Sangdo-Sadong Community Center in the Dongjakgu district in Seoul. There's now less than 2 hours before votes close, but better late than never, many people are coming to the station to cast their votes. I got to speak to some who voted earlier this afternoon.
I believe every citizen should take part in elections. When voting, I considered issues such as housing policies and education policies since my son is still a student. I hope the elected candidate will bring positive changes to the country.
This was my first time voting in a local election in Seoul after moving here from another region, so it felt both new and exciting. As a young single-person household, I hope to see more support for young people and those living alone.
Well, Hae-rim, so what are some last-minute tips for those who have yet to cast their ballots, and what happens after 6 p.m.?
For those who haven't voted yet, remember to bring a valid government-issued ID, either in physical or mobile form, to your local polling stations. Voters must vote at their designated station, which can be looked up on the Election Commission's website. It's also on your voter notice sent by mail. So once polls close, the ballot boxes will be transported to counting centers under police escort. According to the National Election Commission, vote counting will begin once ballot boxes arrive and officials formally declare the start of the process. While arrival times may vary by area, most ballot boxes are expected to reach counting centers at around 6:20 p.m. As mentioned, polling stations will close at 6 p.m., so eligible voters have just a short time left to make their voices heard. Back to you, Sujin.
That was our correspondent Jung Hae-rim at a polling station in Seoul. Party leaders and candidates are out in full force urging supporters to make their voices heard at the ballot box while quietly keeping one eye on the clock. We're covering both of the major parties tonight, and we start with our correspondent inside the ruling Democratic Party's Election Operations Center at the National Assembly. So, Hae-ryun, what's the mood like over there right now?
Good afternoon, Sujin. It's relatively calm and quiet here, and very deliberately so. Party officials are keeping a close eye on voter turnout figures as the voting continues. But the real gathering won't happen until polls close at 6 o'clock later this evening, which is when party leadership will gather here at the DP Situation Room in the National Assembly to watch the exit polls and results come in on a bank of larger screens. Earlier this morning, the Democratic Party held a campaign strategy meeting where party leader Chung Cheong-rae struck a defiant tone, telling supporters that political power doesn't come from the barrel of a gun, but from the ballot box. He urged voters not to stay home, pointing out that in past local elections, the outcome in some races came down to a single vote. Every vote, he said, could be decisive. As for the candidates themselves, most are expected to head to their local campaign offices later tonight, once exit poll data starts coming through at around 6, and as the broader picture emerges in the small hours. The Democratic Party has identified 6 regions as genuinely tight races, including Seoul, Busan, Daegu, Ulsan, and Gyeongsangnam-do and Jeollabuk-do provinces, and has set itself the goal of winning as many of those as possible. And that's all I have for now, so back to you, Sujin.
And we'll be returning to you as the exit polls start to come in. Right, so we just heard from the ruling Democratic Party's Election Operations Center, and we also have our correspondent for the main opposition People Power Party with us. So, Sungjin, what's it like over there?
Right, good afternoon, Sujin. I'm currently standing at the People Power Party headquarters in Yeouido, just a 10-minute walk from the National Assembly. Now, behind me hangs the party's local election slogan, which is cleanly, competently, and time for Korea to rise. Voting has been underway for several hours now, but the atmosphere here still remains relatively quiet, with only a handful of party officials and mostly a room full of reporters here on site. Earlier today, now Chang cast his ballot at his home constituency in Boryong, Chungcheongnam-do Province. Now this is expected to change later this evening as senior campaign and party officials, including party chairman Jang Dong-hyuk, are scheduled together here at the election situation room around 6 p.m. when voting concludes and exit polls are out. Just as I mentioned, Chang cast his ballot earlier in his home constituency before returning to Seoul for final campaign strategy meetings. He urged the public to take part, emphasizing that every vote can make a difference. As Hae-ryun has just talked about, the People Power Party also talked about competitive races in Seoul, Busan, Ulsan, Chungcheongnam-do Province, and Gyeongsang-namdo Province, where party officials are hoping for victories. The PPP has cautious optimism about holding on to its strongholds in Daegu and Gyeongsangbuk-do Province. Now, the party is particularly focused on maximizing turnout among conservative supporters who traditionally favor voting day on election day itself rather than early voting, as officials continue to say their priority is to mobilize every possible vote in hopes of pulling off last-minute gates. That's all I have for now, but I will be back with more updates for a later newscast.
Our thanks to our political correspondents Moon Hae-ryun and An Sung-jin for that live report from the party's situation rooms. We'll return to them later after for the latest developments. For more on how this year's election is playing out, let's turn again to our Kim Mu-kyung at Arirang's extended reality studio. Mu-kyung, tell us more.
Sure. Welcome to Arirang's extended reality to take a closer look at voter turnout. Starting with voter participation. According to data from the National Election Commission as of 3 p.m., voter turnout stands at 51.9%. Out of the 44,649,908 eligible voters, those born on or before June 4, 2008, over 23,164,097 people have cast their ballots as of 3 p.m. today. This is a higher figure by 8.8 percentage points compared to the 8th local elections in 2022 at the same time, and even 1 percentage point higher than the final turnout in 2022. With around 2 hours left until the end of the voting, which should be 6 p.m., more voters will cast their ballots across the country. Moving on to the hourly breakdown of voter participation. Polling stations opened at 6 a.m. and the first official turnout figure released at 7 a.m. stood at 2%, climbing to a little less than 20% at 12 p.m. The reason we are seeing a significant increase starting at 1 p.m. is because the early voting turnout rate conducted at the end of May has been reflected in the voter turnout figures starting at 1 p.m. today, thus standing at 46%. We can see that the number of ballots cast has been increasing with each passing hour. At 2 p.m., the rate stood at 48.9%, reaching around 52% at 3 p.m. Now, turning to the voter turnout by region. Of the country's 16 cities and provinces, Jeollanam-do Province posted the highest voter turnout at 60%. But if you combine Gwangju City, as they are set to launch the integrated Gwangju-Jeonnam Special Metropolitan City, the rate stands at 50.6%. We also have Gangwon-do Province at 57.2%, showing the second highest following Jeollanam-do Province alone, and Jeollabuk-do Province at 56.3%. If we take a closer look at some of the key battleground areas, including 5 regions that both the ruling Democratic Party and the People Power Party have identified as crucial to the race. Starting with Seoul, voter turnout stood at 50.2.7%, and in Gyeonggi-do, the nation's most populous province, the turnout recorded 49%. Gyeongsang-namdo Province is at around 55%, while the country's second largest city, Busan, is at 51.8%. Ulsan and Daegu are currently at around 53%. Finally, let's take a look at the voter turnout in previous local elections. In each of the past 5 elections, voter turnout has exceeded the 50% mark. The highest turnout over the past 2 decades was recorded in 2018 during the 7th local elections, when more than 60% of eligible voters cast their ballots. The most recent election saw the lowest turnout, finishing just above 50%. As voter turnout has already surpassed last time's local elections in 2022, eyes are now on whether the total voter turnout will go over 60%. With just a couple of hours left, we will see how the final voting turns out at 6 p.m. We'll be back at 6:40 p.m. Korea time with more updates. Back to you, Sujin.
All right, thank you for that rundown, Pokyung. This year's election is considered one of the country's most complex ones due to the number of local leaders chosen at once. Park Jin-an reports on the detailed voting process.
Coming exactly 1 year after the 2025 presidential election, voters in Korea are heading to the polls for the 9th nationwide local elections. In most parts of the country, eligible voters aged 18 or older will be handed a total of 7 different colored ballots to elect positions, ranging from provincial governors to local council members. Voters in Sejong City and on Jeju Island, which operate under special administrative systems, will receive just 4 ballots. Some 150,000 foreign residents can vote. To qualify, foreign nationals must have held permanent residency for at least 3 years and be on their local foreigner registry. While early voting was available at any polling station nationwide, voting on election day works a bit differently. Voters must bring a valid ID card or mobile identification app and vote only at their designated polling station based on their resident registration address as of May 12th. Polling stations across the country will be open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. To keep things organized, the voting process is split into 2 rounds. In the first round, voters receive 3 ballots, a white-colored ballot for metropolitan mayor or provincial governor. The light green ballot is to choose the superintendent of education, and the axial ballot is to elect the head of the local district, city, or county. In the second round, voters receive the remaining 4 ballots to select local council members. The light pink and sky gray ballots are used to elect local constituency council members at both the broader provincial and tighter district levels. Lastly, the sky blue and cream ballots are for proportional representation representatives. When voting, you must choose only one candidate or party per ballot. Marking 2 or more names or parties will instantly invalidate your vote. Votes will be counted immediately once the polls close on June 3rd, ushering in a new 4-year term for local leaders, including the next mayor of Seoul. Park Jin-an, Arirang News.
Voters across Korea are heading to the polls today for the country's 9th nationwide local elections. But why do local elections matter? Kim Jin-ho explains why.
On June 3rd, Korea holds its nationwide local elections where voters choose the leaders of their communities. While some decisions are made on a national level, everyday issues like transportation, education, and housing are often handled locally. Let's take the capital, Seoul, as an example. Whoever wins the race for mayor will help shape the daily lives and livelihoods of more than 9 million Seoul residents. Backed by a budget of around $33 billion this year, the mayor determines the direction of the city's policies and spending priorities. It's not just mayors who are elected. At the local level are heads of smaller districts, cities, and counties who handle services closer to daily life. Council members are also elected at both the metropolitan and local levels to oversee government affairs. Some ballots are cast for political parties rather than individual candidates, with proportional seats allocated in both metropolitan and local councils based on each party's share of the vote. The final ballot goes to a superintendent of education who oversees local education policy. Local elections are often seen as a barometer of public sentiment toward the sitting government. They can also serve as a stepping stone for future political leaders, with the number of national figures having built their political careers in local office. Given their close link to community issues, some foreign residents are also eligible to vote, unlike presidential or parliamentary elections. Above all, local elections carry deeper meaning as a foundation of democracy, offering residents a direct voice in local issues. While national politics often dominates the headlines, local governments and councils can have a real impact on the day-to-day lives of local residents. Kim Jun-ho, Arirang News.
집값도 사실 수도권 가격이 너무 높은 편이고 주거도 대부분 수도권에 포진되어 있는 편인데 이걸 조금 가격을 조정을 하고 지방에도 살 수 있도록 인프라를 구축해 주는 게 맞지 않나 생각을 하고 있습니다.
일단 일자리를 늘리는 게 중요하다고 생각해서 그 지역 내에 있는 고용을 창출하냐 못하냐 좀 그런 것들을 중점으로 보고 있습니다.
일단 지금 금전적인 거는 많이 해주시는데 일단 돌봄이나 이제 아기 같으면 교육이나 이런 게 일단 서울이나 대구는 좀 너무 많이 차이 나서 조금 뭐 평준화 시켰으면은 좋을 것 같아요.
그리고 우리 종합병원이 하나 있었으면 좋겠어요. 부여는. 예, 저 대전까지 나가야 되고 그리고 이런 사람 다리 이렇게 불편한 사람은 누가 실어다지 하고 모든 게 불편한 거 많아요.
인기 있는 정책 말고 좀 더 길게 보고 혹시나 이번에 당선되신 분 그 다음에 어떤 분이 오더라도 조금 더 연속성 있는 정책이었으면 좋겠습니다.
There are now less than 2 hours remaining until polls close in South Korea's local elections and parliamentary by-elections. With several key races still too close to call, turnout figures are being closely watched for clues about voter enthusiasm and the potential impact on the final outcome. For more insights, we're joined today by Professor Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hangul University of Foreign Studies. Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so with less than 2 hours remaining until the polls close, what are the turnout trends telling us about voter enthusiasm and also mobilization of voters from both sides?
Yeah, actually, it's a little bit hard to tell, to be honest with you. To start with, like the early voting, that came in at 23.5%, which was relatively high. In fact, one of the highest ever. But I think most of the political scientists and the polling experts say that we're sort of in a period of transition and have been for a while, and so the degree to which the early voting tells us very much about what's going to happen in terms of the final voter turnout, and then downstream of that, how that's going to affect one party or another more in terms of mobilization, I think has become more difficult to evaluate. We are looking at right now roughly 52% as of 3 p.m. in terms of turnout, which is an increase, significant increase over the last time. But I don't think it necessarily tells us very much about which of the two parties has perhaps done a better job of mobilizing their voters. I was listening to the reporter talk about some of the regional turnout there, and it does look like, for instance, Jeolla province and Gangwon-do province, had relatively high turnout numbers, higher than some of the PPP strongholds. But I'm not really sure that means very much in terms of the way that things are going to turn out in terms of the final results, because the Jeolla province, just to give you the exact example, most of the time has a relatively high turnout of its supporters anyway. But because of the localization effect, it doesn't necessarily mean very much for the entirety of how the races are going to turn out. I think the other big question is, are we going to get close to the 60% turnout mark, which was the highest ever back in 2018? It looks like we're clearly going to be higher than we were in 2022 and 2024. All things being equal, I would say the higher turnout probably slightly favors the Democratic Party, but that's not entirely certain either. It's a very interesting race this year and a little bit hard to call in terms of these numbers, in part because this is a bit of a special situation, considering that this is after the presidential election last year, the first nationwide election after the martial law, and so both sides I think are perhaps somewhat in a different position than they are normally.
Right. Another reason why there's so much attention on this is that this is a critical test for both President Lee Jae-myung and the ruling Democratic Party, who both obviously, which currently holds the presidency and the parliamentary majority. So what is the baseline expectation for the ruling party to define this as a decisive victory? And how would you assess its campaign strategy for this election?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And the working hypothesis from most people was that this would be a near landslide for the DP, but we've seen many of the races tighten in the polling in the month or so before the election actually took place. Although Lee Jae-myung himself remains popular, essentially a year after his election, he's at 60%, sometimes a little bit above, sometimes a little bit below, which is a very high number. But it seems like nonetheless the races have tightened for a number of different reasons, which I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about. I think for the DP to really claim that this was a decisive victory, I think in the first place you need to take the Seoul mayorship. That seems to be pretty critical to me. To have obviously the presidency, the National Assembly, and Seoul all in the hands of the Democratic Party, I think would be a real moment of strength for that party, obviously. You can clearly claim that that's a decisive victory. Adding Busan on top of that, obviously, would be important. If they could go in and pick off Daegu, a traditional stronghold of the conservatives, that would obviously be a coup as well. So those, I think, are some things that I'm looking at. So all three of those races. Busan would obviously be a victory as well. And the Democratic Party seems to think that Daegu and Busan are in play. I think we'll have to see about that. Beyond that, we've got 16 total provinces and mayors for whom the executive is up. I think 11 or 12 of those going to the Democratic Party, I think, would be fairly decisive. And of the National Assembly races, there are 14 of them. The vast majority, I believe 13 of them, are held or sort of traditional or held most recently by Democratic Party candidates, and so obviously the Democratic Party needs to hang on to a huge majority of those as well. In terms of their strategy, basically the Democratic Party has, in the first place, piggybacked on Lee Jae-myung's popularity, as I mentioned, relatively speaking. Pocketbook issues, obviously. The democratic restoration narrative after the martial law and a sort of pragmatic foreign policy, especially considering the shakeup that's happening globally with Donald Trump in the White House in the United States and the crisis in the Middle East. And so I think that strategy makes a lot of sense, but we'll see whether or not it pays off.
So as for the People Power Party, obviously as a Democratic Party has both the presidency and the parliamentary majority, they have been kind of pushing for a checks and balance message. So how much weight has that checks and balance message kind of held with voters during this campaign? And if the PPP fails to protect its own key battleground states, what does this mean for the future of the conservative movement here in Korea?
Yeah, I heard you refer to as battleground states. That's the narrative that we have in the United States. So I'm familiar with that. This is obviously a huge question for the PPP. And I actually think that both substantively and politically, the PPP is right. You do need a counterbalance to a Democratic Party or any party, which gets too much power. We have an expression in English, it's an old one: power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's very important in democracies that you have at least one opposition party which is in good working order to provide a counterbalance to the other side. Substantively, that's correct. And I think also when you look at some of the things that the Lee administration has been doing, they are perhaps correct to call out that some of the funny games that the Lee administration has been playing with prosecutorial reform and judicial reform more generally, and any other number of areas where it seems like the playing field has been tilted a little bit in a way that might not be healthy for the long-term democracy of Korea. I think that is a correct message, both substantively, and it's also politically, I think, correct as well. The problem is, of course, for the PPP, is that they still have not adequately shown remorse, much less reform, after the martial law incident. The party is in disarray. There are people who are, obviously demotivated to vote for them, who are their supporters because they've looked at what's happened in terms of the infighting there, and especially the fact that a very large faction of Yoon supporters continue to be extremely influential and powerful within the party and are very recalcitrant about saying that they made a mistake and that Yoon made a mistake and that the martial law was a mistake and apologizing and moving on for it. And to the extent that they have done that, it's been too little too late, unfortunately. So unfortunately, the PPP is, I think, in a position that they need to be as an opposition. However, they're a very bad messenger for we're the counterweight to Lee's dictatorial impulses, because they haven't gotten over their support for Yoon's dictatorial impulses. And that's a real problem. And so I think that very well, if anything ends up hurting in this race, it's going to end up being that.
So we've looked at the broader pictures. Now moving on to the local elections, we'll start with the Seoul mayor election. So which aspects of the two candidates' campaign message do you think gained the most traction? And do you think they were effective in hitting the issues that Seoul residents actually care about?
Yeah, so this is, very simply housing.
Right.
This is what everyone cares about in the Seoul area. Both candidates talked a lot about it. Both candidates have, when you look at the sort of bottom line numbers, a plan that looks relatively similar, which is to build roughly 300,000 housing units. The primary difference is whether or not that's going to be more of a government-led drive or whether or not it's going to have a large private sector component to it. So both Mayor Oh and challenger Jong Won-oh, they both have clearly honed in on the fact that this is what a lot of people care about. It's obviously a huge deal here. It's especially a big deal, I think, when you look at how the housing market here has not only, of course, become very difficult to get into in terms of the housing ladder, but also is now being juiced both in this area and in the sort of surrounding Gyeonggi province by the large bonuses that have been going out to SK Hynix and Samsung, and how the distortions that have taken place in the marketplace there. So housing is obviously a huge deal. Both candidates have hit it. I honestly don't think that that we have much of a detail, to be honest with you, about how they're going to do that. There was only one debate where there were a lot of candidates who were talking, so it wasn't just the two main candidates. There were lots of other candidates who were talking, so it was a little bit difficult, to be honest with you, I think, for your average person to really figure out which of the two plans would be the most appealing to them in terms of solving the housing issue. On the side of the incumbent, Oh Se-hoon, he, in addition to the housing message, has again sort of picked up the baton of pushing back against, President Lee's dictatorial impulses. And I feel like in Seoul that might not be the best message. He's a fairly good messenger for it because he, has largely been on the right side of things in terms of, condemning the PPP for their support of Yoon and sort of trying to distance himself from the martial law incident. He did that quite early. So he's actually a relatively good messenger, but I'm not sure that this is the message that's really going to work very well in Seoul. In addition to that, I think he's been hurt a little bit by the Hangang bus problems that have taken place. These riverboat transportation services that have had several stops because of various problems, and of course recently the bridge collapse, I think, as well, may simply hurt him in terms of sort of last second allowing candidate Chung, who's pointing this out, by the way, to say that he's going to be the candidate who's going to bring competence back to administration and the city of Seoul.
I think there's so many factors at play, even to today. You mentioned the bridge earlier as well, which is why so much attention is on this. So thank you just so much for coming in and sharing insights with us today, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
On May 10th, 1948, we stood in lines with no end in sight, holding an unfamiliar piece of paper in our hands. It was Korea's first election, held under the watch of the United Nations. A nation's longing for democracy filled the ballot boxes, driving voter turnout to a remarkable 95.5%. Since then, countless elections have come and gone. Through moments of hardship and change, one thing never wavered: our passion for democracy. And we kept asking ourselves, how can more people take part more easily? One answer was early voting. Today, all you need is your ID. On the way to work, at the airport before a trip, anywhere in the country, your vote can reach the ballot box wherever you are. Technology changed the process too. Long nights of ballot counting gave way to faster, more accurate automated systems, making elections more transparent and trustworthy. What once felt like a long and distant road in 1948 has become one of the closest rights we hold today. The process may be simpler now, but the weight of the vote has never changed. This June 3rd, we carry the torch of Korea's democracy to the ballot box, protecting the freedom generations fought to build.
President Donald Trump said on Tuesday local time the U.S. Iran negotiations were still active, rejecting Iranian state media reports that talks have collapsed over the recent escalation of the conflict in Lebanon. Yoon-jin reports.
Negotiations between the United States and Iran are apparently ongoing. Amid reports from Iranian media that the talks had been halted due to fighting in Lebanon, U.S. President Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social that such reports were false and erroneous, and emphasized that negotiations have been going on continuously, though where the talks were leading was still unknown. His refutal came after Iranian news agencies reported that the clashes on Tuesday were triggered when Iran stopped communicating with mediators about extending a ceasefire. According to Reuters on Wednesday, Tehran launched the offensive as a direct retaliation to a U.S. strike on an Iranian tanker near the Strait of Hormuz and a military communications tower on Qasem Island. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claims to have struck the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain using a barrage of missiles and drones. U.S. Central Command, however, firmly rejected these assertions. In a public statement, CENTCOM said that all recent Iranian attacks directed at American forces failed, and that incoming projectiles were either intercepted or fell short of their targets. Talks for a ceasefire in the Iran war and the loosening of Iran's chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz have become increasingly conjoined with the conflict in Lebanon. While Iran insists that any potential truce in the war must also ease the fighting in Lebanon, Israel and the U.S. maintain their stance that the fighting in Lebanon is separate from the Iran war negotiations. 이은진, Arirang News.
U.S. Trade Representative James in Korea has pointed to South Korea's steel industry as an example of what it calls government-driven economic intervention as the Trump administration continues to push for a new global trade framework. In an article published in the IMS Finance and Development magazine, Greer questioned how South Korea, despite lacking major natural resources such as coal and iron ore, became a global steelmaking powerhouse. Greer argued that government interventions have distorted global trade, creating persistent trade imbalances between nations. His remarks come as the USTR investigates South Korea, China, Japan, and other trading partners over alleged unfair trade practices, a move that could pave the way for additional tariffs. That concludes our 4 p.m. edition of Arirang News. Join us again at 6:40 p.m. Korea time for our special election coverage with the latest developments from key battleground races across South Korea. Thank you for watching.